At 56 years old, I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like. I was wrong. Rock bottom isn't losing your job or facing financial ruin. Rock bottom is standing on your own front porch, suitcase in hand, watching your wife of 28 years laugh as two men carry your belongings to the curb. "Don't look so pathetic, John," Jessica said, her voice dripping with a cruelty I'd never heard before. She stood in the doorway wearing a silk robe I'd bought her for our anniversary, her blonde hair perfectly styled even at 10 a.m. Behind her, I could see Marcus, her personal trainer, young enough to be our son. He smirked at me over her shoulder, his muscled arms crossed like he owned the place. "Jessica, please," I pleaded, my voice cracking in a way that made me hate myself. "We can work this out. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it." She laughed, the sound cutting through me like broken glass. "Fix it, John? You still don't get it, do you?" She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with something else. "Someone else. There's nothing broken here except you. There never was anything to fix. 28 years of marriage. 28 years of believing we were building something together. I had worked 60-hour weeks at the manufacturing plant, saved every penny, skipped vacations and fancy dinners so we could pay off our mortgage early. I thought we were a team. "The house is mine, John," she continued, pulling a legal document from behind her back. "Daddy's lawyers made sure of that. You signed the papers yourself last month when you thought you were just updating our insurance beneficiaries." My stomach dropped as I recognized my own signature. She had tricked me into signing away my rights to our home, the place where we'd planned to grow old together. "You can't do this," I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew she already had. A second man appeared behind Marcus. Tony, I think she'd called him. Older than Marcus, maybe 40, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to work for anything real. He put his hand on Jessica's waist possessively, and she leaned into him like they'd been together for years. "Actually, she can," Tony said, his voice smooth and educated. "I should know. I'm the lawyer who drew up the papers." He smiled with perfect white teeth. "You might want to find somewhere else to be, John. We're expecting company later, and it might get loud." The humiliation burned through me like acid. Not only had she planned this betrayal, she'd recruited her lovers to participate in it. They were all standing there, watching me fall apart and enjoying every second. "Where am I supposed to go?" The words came out broken and desperate. Jessica shrugged. "That's not my problem anymore. You're 56, John. Most men your age would have figured out how to take care of themselves by now." "I gave you everything," I said, hating how weak I sounded. "No," she said, her eyes cold as winter. "You gave mediocrity. You gave me a life of settling for less. Did you really think I was going to spend my golden years stuck with someone who never had any ambition? Someone who never wanted more than a paycheck and a mortgage payment?" The neighbors were watching now. Mrs. Patterson from across the street pretended to tend her roses while she listened to every word. The Johnsons' teenage son was recording everything on his phone from their upstairs window. My humiliation was becoming neighborhood entertainment. "Please, Jessica, at least give me time to find somewhere to go." She checked her watch, the gold Rolex I'd saved 3 months to buy her for her 50th birthday. "You have until I finish my coffee." "That's about 10 minutes. Marcus and Tony went back inside, leaving me standing there with my wife of nearly 3 decades. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Maybe regret, maybe sympathy, but it was gone before I could be sure. "Why?" I asked. "After all these years?" "Why now?" She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then she spoke, and her words destroyed the last piece of hope I'd been clinging to. "Because I never loved you, John. I married you because I thought you'd amount to something. I thought you had potential. But you're exactly the same man you were at 28, just older and more tired." She paused, studying my face like she was memorizing my pain. "I wasted the best years of my life waiting for you to become someone worth being married to." The front door slammed shut, leaving me alone on the porch of the home we'd shared for 15 years. Inside, I could hear laughter. Jessica's laugh mixed with deeper masculine voices. They were celebrating. They were celebrating my destruction. I picked up my suitcase and walked to my truck, a 15-year-old Ford that I'd maintained myself because we'd been saving money for someday projects that would never happen now. My hands shook as I turned the key. For a moment, the engine wouldn't start. Even my truck seemed ready to abandon me. When it finally turned over, I sat there for a long time, trying to figure out where to go. I had $837 in my checking account, no credit cards that weren't maxed out, and no family except a sister in Oregon, who I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. That's when I remembered the envelope. It was sitting in my glove compartment where it had been for 15 years, yellowed and forgotten. My father had given it to me the day before he died, along with strict instructions not to open it unless I was truly desperate. At the time, I'd thought he was being dramatic. Dad had always been prone to grand gestures and mysterious statements that turned out to be nothing special. "When there's nowhere else to turn," he'd said, gripping my hand with fingers that were already growing cold. "When you feel like you've lost everything and there's no way forward, that's when you open this, Johnny. Not before." I'd been 28 then, married for less than a year, full of hope for the future. The idea that I might someday be truly desperate seemed impossible. Dad had been a simple man, a mechanic who fixed cars and lived in the same small house his entire adult life. What could he possibly leave me that would matter in a real crisis? Now, sitting in my truck while my wife entertained her lovers in what used to be our home, I finally understood what desperation felt like. I pulled the envelope from the glove compartment with trembling fingers. My name was written on the front in Dad's careful handwriting, along with a note, "For John, when all else fails." Inside was a single credit card, old and yellowed with age, and a slip of paper with a 4-digit number written in pencil. Nothing else. No explanation, no instructions, just a card that looked like it belonged in a museum and a PIN number. I almost threw it away. What good was an expired credit card from a dead man who'd barely made $20,000 a year? But I had nowhere else to go and no other options. The card felt strangely warm in my hand, and something about the way Dad had insisted I keep it safe made me hesitate. I drove to the nearest bank, a small branch of First National Bank that I'd passed 1,000 times. Inside, the teller, a young woman who looked barely out of high school, eyed me nervously. I probably looked like a mess. I slid the card across the counter. "I'd like to see what's on this account, please." She took the card, her eyes widening as she examined it. "Sir, this card is ancient. It looks like it's from the 1980s. It was my father's," I explained, my voice raspy. "He told me to use it if I was ever truly desperate." She typed the numbers into her computer, her brow furrowed. Then her eyes went wide, her face drained of color. She looked up at me, her mouth agape. "Sir, quickly, look at this!" she screamed, pushing the monitor toward me. My blood ran cold. Number flashed, screen $127,458,912.33. Over $127 million. My father, the humble mechanic, had been a millionaire, a multi-millionaire. The teller was frantic, calling her manager, who then called security. They thought I was trying to perpetrate some kind of fraud. It took nearly an hour to convince them I was John Miller, the son of the account holder, and that the card was legitimate. The bank manager, a stern woman named Ms. Albright, finally sat me down in her office. She explained that my father had been an incredibly astute investor, quietly building a massive fortune over decades. He'd kept it secret, she said, because he valued his privacy and wanted to live a normal life. He'd also set up a complex trust, ensuring that the money would only be accessible to me under very specific, dire circumstances. This old card was the key. "Your father also left a safety deposit box with us," Ms. Albright said. "He stipulated it should only be opened after the primary accounts were accessed." I left the bank that day with a new understanding of my father and a burning question. Why the secrecy? Why had he hidden this from me for so long? And why had he specifically instructed me to open it only when I was truly desperate? The next day, I went to the storage unit my father had rented for years. I remembered him always saying it was for old car parts, but I'd never seen him take anything in or out. Inside, it wasn't car parts. It was an office, meticulously organized, filled with files, a computer, and a shredder, and a locked metal filing cabinet. The key to the safety deposit box, which Miss Albright had given me, also opened the filing cabinet. Inside, I found a trove of documents, financial statements, legal papers, and a thick folder labeled Jessica and Margaret. My heart hammered in my chest. Margaret was my sister, 5 years older than me. We hadn't spoken in years, ever since she'd tried to convince me to put Dad in a nursing home, claiming he was mentally unstable. The folder contained a chilling narrative. There were bank statements showing regular, large transfers from Jessica's personal account to Margaret's. There were copies of medical records detailing Dad's declining health, but with annotations in a different handwriting, highlighting symptoms of confusion and memory loss. There were legal documents, drafted by Tony, Jessica's lawyer lover, outlining a plan to declare me mentally unstable following Dad's death, using my grief and emotional state as evidence that I was unfit to manage large amounts of money. Margaret would step in as my next of kin and closest family member to manage the inheritance for my own protection. The final document in the folder was a letter dated just 3 weeks ago, written in Jessica's handwriting. Margaret, it's time to move forward with the final plan. John's becoming suspicious about the divorce papers, and I can't keep pretending much longer. I'm going to force him out of the house this week and let Tony move in officially. Once John's out and desperate, we'll push toward a breakdown that gives you legal grounds to take control of any inheritance that surfaces. The house is already in my name, thanks to those papers he signed, so he'll have nothing left but whatever Dad might have hidden. When that comes to light, you'll be there to help him manage it. I sat in that storage unit until well past midnight, reading through 15 years of documentation that painted a picture of betrayal so systematic and complete that it took my breath away. This wasn't a marriage that had gone bad or a family that had grown apart. This was a carefully orchestrated long-term fraud, and I had been the target from the very beginning. The next morning, I drove to the safety deposit box that Dad's key opened. The First National Bank's vault manager, a woman in her 60s who remembered my father, led me to box number 218 in the secured area of their basement. Your father was very specific about this box, she said as she inserted her master key. He left instructions that it should only be opened by you personally and only after you'd inherited his primary accounts. Inside the box was another world of secrets that my father had hidden for decades. There were photographs of Jessica that I'd never seen before, surveillance pictures of her entering hotels, meeting with men I didn't recognize, and engaging in activities that clearly predated our marriage by several years. Some of the photos were time-stamped from our honeymoon period, when I'd thought we were building a life together based on love and trust. There were legal documents showing that Jessica had tried to open credit accounts using my father's personal information, including his social security number and employment history. She'd been denied because Dad had placed fraud alerts on his credit file, but the attempts were documented. Most shocking were the recorded phone conversations. Dad had somehow obtained recordings of Jessica's phone calls with Margaret, with Tony, and with other people I didn't recognize. The conversation spanned 8 years and revealed a level of manipulation and calculation that I'd never imagined possible. In one recording from 4 years ago, Jessica was talking to someone named Dr. Richards about prescription medications that could cause memory problems and confusion. She wanted to know about drugs that could be administered without the target's knowledge, substances that would make someone appear mentally incompetent without causing obvious physical symptoms. "I need something subtle," her voice said through the small speaker. "Something that would make an older man seem forgetful and disoriented, but not obviously poisoned. It's for a family situation. We're concerned about my father-in-law's mental state, and we want to document his decline for legal purposes. My father had been protecting himself from being drugged and manipulated by my own wife." Another recording, this one more recent, captured a conversation between Jessica and Margaret about the timing of Dad's death. "He's getting suspicious," Jessica said. "I think he knows we've been investigating his finances. Tony thinks we should speed up our timeline." "What does that mean?" Margaret's voice was fuzzy but audible. "It means we might need to help him along to his final reward. He's old. He's got heart problems, and accidents happen to elderly people all the time." My hands were shaking as I realized what they were discussing. My father hadn't died of natural causes 15 years ago. He'd died because Jessica and Margaret had decided he was more valuable dead than alive. The final item in the safety deposit box was a letter addressed to me, dated just 1 week before Dad's death. "Johnny, if you're reading this, it means they finally succeeded in killing me. I've known about Jessica's plan for 2 years, and I've been documenting everything. The evidence is all here, son. Jessica poisoned me gradually with digitalis, a heart medication that's undetectable in normal doses, but fatal when accumulated over time. Margaret provided her with the pills from her own prescription. They thought they were being clever, but old mechanics learned to spot poison just like they learned to spot bad oil. I could have stopped them, could have had them arrested, but then you never would have learned who they really were. You would have spent your life wondering if maybe I'd been wrong about Jessica, if maybe she really did love you, and I'd been a paranoid old fool. This way, you'll know the truth. You'll understand that the woman you married never loved you. She loved the idea of your inheritance. You'll understand that your sister sold you out for money she never deserved. And most importantly, you'll understand that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones you need to fear most. Use the evidence, son. Use the money and make them pay for what they took from both of us." I left the bank that afternoon with copies of everything. My father's final message burned into my memory, and a rage burned in my chest that I'd never felt before. Jessica hadn't just betrayed me. She'd murdered my father and spent 15 years of our marriage living off his hidden wealth, all while planning to steal mine. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, police reports, and emotional upheaval. The evidence my father had meticulously collected was irrefutable. Jessica and Margaret were arrested. The charges were staggering: conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted murder, and ultimately murder. The day of Jessica's confession was a cold, rainy afternoon. She sat across from me in a sterile interrogation room, her perfectly styled blonde hair now limp, her expensive clothes replaced by a drab prison jumpsuit. Her defiance had crumbled, replaced by a hollow-eyed despair. The police had presented her with the overwhelming evidence, including her own recorded conversations. There was no denying it. "Why, Jessica?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Why did you kill my father?" She looked at me, her eyes finally meeting mine, devoid of the coldness that had been there for so long. "He was getting in the way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He knew too much. He was going to expose everything." She confessed to poisoning my father with digitalis, supplied by Margaret. She confessed to the elaborate scheme to defraud me, to the fake divorce papers, to bringing Marcus and Tony into our home as part of the plan. She cried. Not out of remorse, I realized, but out of self-pity. She was sorry she got caught, not sorry for what she'd done. I watched her, feeling nothing. The anger, the pain, the 28 years of false emotion had finally been drained away. When she recovered enough to hold a pen, she signed the confession and the legal documents that severed every connection between us. She signed away her rights to the house, to alimony, to any claim on my inheritance or my future. She signed away 28 years of marriage as if they'd never happened, because in any way that mattered, they hadn't. "Where will you go?" I asked as she prepared to leave. "I don't know," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I have a sister in Florida who might let me stay with her for a while if I tell her the right story." "Don't tell her any story," I said. "Tell her the truth. You might find it's easier to keep track of." Jessica walked to the front door, then turned back one last time. "John, I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I really am sorry." "No, you're not," I said quietly. "You're sorry you got caught. There's a difference. She left, without another word, closing the door behind her with a soft click that echoed through the house like a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. 6 months later, I was standing in the garden behind the house my father had secretly owned for 20 years, watching the sunrise through maple trees he'd planted the year I was born. The house was bigger than the one Jessica and I had shared, older but better maintained, with rooms full of furniture covered in white sheets and photographs of a family I was only now getting to know. Dad had left detailed instructions about this house, too, along with letters explaining why he'd kept it secret, why he'd maintained our smaller home as a facade, and why he'd wanted me to discover this place, only after I'd learned the truth about Jessica and Margaret. "This is your real inheritance, Johnny," his final letter had said. "Not the money, though that's nice to have. Not the investments, though they'll keep you comfortable. Your real inheritance is the knowledge that you come from people who work hard, plan carefully, and protect the people they love. Your real inheritance is freedom from people who would use you and then throw you away." The garden was exactly as he described it in his letters. Roses my mother had planted before she died, vegetables that grew wild now but still produced tomatoes and corn every summer, and a small bench where Dad had spent his evenings, planning for a future he'd never lived to see. I sat on that bench every morning now, drinking coffee from a mug that had belonged to my grandfather, reading newspapers that told me about a world I was no longer afraid to be part of. Jessica's threats and manipulations seemed like memories from someone else's life. Margaret was serving 12 years in federal prison for conspiracy, murder, and fraud. Her gambling addiction had been exposed during the trial, along with evidence that she'd been skimming money from the nursing home where she worked. She'd lost everything: her house, her career, her freedom, and her co-conspirator had disappeared as completely as if she'd never existed. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she was living in a trailer park outside Tallahassee, working at a convenience store, and trying to convince people she was the victim of a vindictive ex-husband. No one believed her, but it didn't matter. She was no longer my problem. I used some of Dad's money to establish a scholarship fund in his name for kids who wanted to learn automotive repair but couldn't afford trade school. I used some more to quietly help families in our old neighborhood who were struggling with medical bills or job loss. But mostly, I just lived. I learned to cook the meals Dad had loved. I restored the vintage cars he'd collected and hidden in a garage I'd never known existed. I traveled to places he'd always wanted to visit but never could because he'd been too busy protecting his family and building their future. And every evening, I sat in his chair in his real living room, surrounded by photos of a man who'd been so much more than I'd ever imagined. And I felt grateful. Not for the money he'd left me, though it had given me choices I'd never had before. Not for the revenge I'd been able to exact on the people who'd betrayed us both, though justice had its own satisfaction. I felt grateful for the lesson he'd spent his lifetime teaching me: that the people who truly love you will sacrifice for your happiness, while the people who pretend to love you will sacrifice you for their own. It had taken 56 years and the loss of everything I thought mattered, but I finally understood the difference, and for the first time in my adult life, I was completely at peace.